I've listened to people in this courtroom blame your parents for the reason why you've killed my son. I've listened to people talk about the trauma that you have gone through. We have all gone through trauma, but it doesn't mean that we brutally kill a 7-year-old.
Hi guys, thanks for joining me as ever. Today's case has got quite a lot of moving parts. The murder of Ethan Hauschultz is one of those that is utterly horrific, but also has these key players. And where guilt is concerned, some of you may feel that certain parties are more culpable than others, but that might not actually be represented in the sentences that play out. So strap in. It's going to be one of those that makes you think and makes you feel in ways that might involve a little bit of conflict. Also, if you're new to my channel, I release my content here twice weekly. If you like this content, you can get more of it on my YouTube membership and Patreon, where I release full-length videos and podcasts there. Thanks to every single one of you supporting me there. Can't do this without you. Also, if you do like my content, can you give me a like? Because apparently it's really important for the algorithm. It means that my content gets out to more people. If you haven't subscribed, why don't you? It takes a second. Get your notifications on so you never miss an episode. And before we crack on with today's true crime case, just showing off my new merch. I would be wearing it, but guys, I'm just weeks away from having a baby and everything's very hot at the moment. So my Vigilante. I love this hoodie. Loads of you are ordering it because we all have the same taste. It says, when the system fails, we prevail. Very good quality. Like I said, such good quality. I can't wear it because I'll melt otherwise with my lights, etc. that I'm filming with. Let's crack on with today's true crime case. Let's go back to April the 20th, 2018. This is when 7-year-old Ethan Hauschultz is rushed to hospital in rural Wisconsin. Now, bear in mind, he is very close to death at this point, and the reason for that is his body is literally freezing cold. He's barely clinging to life at this point. And understandably, when emergency services come and see the state of this child, and when he's actually admitted to hospital, the first question is, what on earth has happened? Why is he almost freezing? And also, why is he bruised in multiple places? And his guardians basically suggest that he'd fallen out of a tree, he'd collapsed in the snow. But let's be clear, when you take a child to the emergency room, the actual individual professionals dealing with that child and trying to make them well are very, very aware of bruising patterns because they're all trained in safeguarding, and they can tell recent bruises to faded bruises. And we all know that some children, they are always in the wars, as my mum would have said. I was one of those kids, constantly bruised head to foot. But it is more contextual and childhood orientated when these are around the knees because you're falling over, or the elbows. But when they look at patterns of bruising that seem different to this, it tells a very different story. And that different story is that there is some kind of abuse going on. And like I said as well, the healing of bruises tells a particular story because it will demonstrate an instantaneous incident where somebody is harmed or bruised in a fall, for example, versus historic protracted abuse that is played out in the tapestry of the body, in the map of the body, because that's what it becomes to these kind of medics and investigators when we're dealing with a homicide. Now, as investigators start to look further into the Hauschultz household, they do realise that there's quite a disturbing pattern of abuse. And this is really where it all begins and spirals for the Hauschultz family. Because to all intents and purposes from the outside looking in, nobody was that suspicious of them. But boy, if anybody should have been suspicious about this family, anybody living locally to them should have. Because they were making the kids do things outside that if I had walked past and witnessed, I would have been straight on the phone to child services, or I would have personally removed that child myself. It's as simple as that, because what was going on was torture. It's the only way it can be described. It was a house of horrors. It was a house of torture. It was a house of discipline which disguised the actual true abuse that was playing out. Let's talk about our victim, the gorgeous, innocent, lovely Ethan J. Hauschultz. He was only born in 2010. 2010, and here we are talking about his demise. He was born in Manitowoc County in Wisconsin. People who knew him said he was just that typical kind of boy. He was really sweet-natured, he was really energetic, probably had a huge amount of energy. That's what boys of a young age tend to have, and shouldn't they just be allowed to run free? That's the reality As loving adults, whether we're parents or carers, or whether we just have some contact with children, we expect them to be a little bit feral and wild when they're young, because when else in life do you truly ever get the opportunity to express yourself in those ways? You just get more and more schooled and blueprint orientated into how you're meant to be. And when you're a child, just for a fleeting period, you get to actually just live. He also had numerous biological siblings, but like a lot of children, because the reality is there are a lot of children who go through things like this, his childhood was really turbulent and he had a very unstable childhood. He actually had a twin, and the twin will be referred to in this case as child one. Now, in 2017, so this is when Ethan is just 6 years of age, Wisconsin Child Protective Services, they remove him and they remove his siblings from the parental home. And the reason for that is obviously down to the fact that they're concerned about the safety of the children. So in lots of cases like this, where children are removed from a parental home, the first port of call is to find out whether there's anyone in the extended family who can actually take the children. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it means that they don't have to then put them into the system. And secondly, it breeds familiarity and a connection. And that's really good if you create an environment that is safe for those children to stay, because the child doesn't feel abandoned and excluded fully from the family. Now, it turns out, very fortunately, as far as they're concerned, I'm sure at the very beginning of this, that there is an option. So they're placed with extended family as part of a kinship care agreement. So this is when somebody related to the child takes kinship care. Now, Ethan's court-appointed guardians became his great-uncle Timothy Hauschultz and his great-aunt Tina McKeever Hauschultz. So they basically live in the rural town of Newton, Wisconsin, and they say, yeah, we've got room in our home, we'll take the kids. Social services genuinely felt at the time that they believed Ethan would be in a really stable, caring environment with that extended family network. But I would say their investigations fell short massively. I don't think they did the due diligence where placing him with this particular family is concerned. I don't believe that it was the right placement for him, and it will be very evident in what I tell you about what happened to him. The events that take place next genuinely do underscore and underline just how little research Wisconsin Child Protective Services are undertaken in the background of Ethan's new guardians, and that's harrowing, because when you consider the fact that if you're adopting a child, particularly in the UK, I can relate to this because we were looking at adoption, it's extensive. The due diligence that they do on you, from how much you earn to what your house is like to what your exes think of you, all of these things play in, and they should, because even though it's really affronting and really puts you off a lot of the time to go ahead with the process, the reality is they're thinking about the child-centric nature of the placement, which is all about the child. To not do enough due diligence into the background of people you're placing these children with means, of course, there could be red flags that you're avoiding or ignoring. And that's exactly what happens here. So this placement has played out. And of course, not long after, in fact, the 20th of April, 2018, Ethan is literally brought to the ER by his court-appointed guardians, Timothy and Tina. So they've turned up with him at the emergency room. And of course, what is their story when they bring this freezing child into hospital? They say that they found him collapsed in the backyard after he'd fallen out of a tree. That's their story. So he's been in the backyard in thick snow thinking, you know what I'm going to do today? I'm just going to have a climb of these trees. I mean, that in itself concerns me because, look, we've all been kids. We all enjoy snow. But it isn't the primary desire of most children at times when heavy snowfall has arrived to climb trees. You're usually thinking about building snowmans, or you're thinking about going on your sledge. So it just feels a little bit out of context, the fact that he's been up a tree. And also, heavy snowfall, if you fall from a tree in heavy snowfall, the likelihood is you're not going to end up very badly injured because the snowfall is going to give you a soft landing. Just throwing it out there because that immediately speaks to me of red flags. Now, at this point, he's totally unresponsive, obviously because they're saying he's fallen out of a tree and landed in snow, so then evidencing that he had a soft landing, essentially. He had a really low body temperature, which is evident that he's been outside for a period of time. But also, they could see there were multiple bruises and multiple injuries all over his body. And it's so serious when he arrives in hospital that the medical staff literally have to start life-saving measures And in spite of the fact that they do their best, there's nothing that can be done. This gorgeous little boy, Ethan, he's pronounced dead at 9:22 p.m. Now, the doctors are wise to the fact that something far more malevolent has happened to this beautiful boy. So they actually speak to the police and they say, look, we suspect that child abuse is played out here. Now, they go ahead and do an autopsy. This is an unexpected death. It's a child death, so of course they're going to do an autopsy. And an investigator's report from the Milwaukee County Medical Examiner's Office, they noted that Ethan had died following, quote, strenuous physical punishment outdoors and prolonged environmental exposure while covered buried in snow. So not that he's just been climbing trees, being a bit boisterous, fell out, landed in the snow, died. Absolute lies. They can tell from what happened to his body, this child had basically been buried alive after, obviously, some very serious punishment that had occurred. And when we're talking about punishment, we're clearly talking about abuse in this case. Now, Dr. Weislower Tomlat performed the autopsy on Ethan's body, and they determined that the cause of death was hypothermia due to environmental cold exposure, along with lots of other significant conditions, including blunt force injuries to the head, chest, and abdomen. And I'm just going to go through some of these, because bear in mind, the Guardians are saying he just had a fall out of a tree. Well, if he had a fall out of the tree, why did he have blunt force injuries of the head and neck, acute subdural hemorrhage, abrasions to the neck, abrasions and contusions to the head, blunt force injuries to the chest and abdomen, a fracture of the 11th rib, soft tissue hemorrhages, right perinephric hemorrhage, which is bleeding that occurs around the right kidney, which is specifically within the perirenal space. That's the area that's surrounding the kidney. There were also abrasions to his chest, to his abdomen, to his back, blunt force injuries to the extremities. I mean, he had just been like somebody's punching bag. It's as simple as that. And Detective Chris Bessler, who's investigating the case, also advised that infrared imaging of the area around Ethan's back by his 11th rib actually showed a print consistent with boot footwear. So he'd been stamped on as well. I mean, this is absolutely blindsidingly horrific when you just think about the list of injuries this little boy had. He's literally the smallest frame. He's a tiny boy, and he has been beaten within an inch of his life and then left in the snow, clearly to end his life, essentially. Now, the police were and continue to be unbelievably suspicious of Ethan's Guardians. So the investigation begins immediately into them. So let's talk about who these individuals are, the Guardians who've taken care, apparently, of Ethan and are meant to be there for his best interests. And yet, here we are. Ethan's dead, and they're now in the line of fire, and rightly so. So let's talk about Timothy Hauschultz. He was born on the 1st of July 1970. And he and his wife became court-appointed guardians of Ethan and also his two siblings when he was aged 47 to 48. So around that 47 to 48th birthday, he became their guardians. Now, Timothy, who was with Tina, they were also the adoptive parents of Damian Hauschultz. Now, Damian Hauschultz also lived in the home. So there were multiple children living in the home, and both the guardians' biological and adoptive children, as well as Ethan and his siblings, all lived in that place. Now, crucially, Timothy, the guy who's been appointed guardian, where they've just handed over little Ethan, believing that this is going to be a perfectly safe environment. Well, it turns out they probably should have looked at his background. He had a really lengthy criminal history, and that history raised a lot of concerns. So he'd previously been convicted of child abuse. I kid you not, and riddle me that. Just think about that lack of due diligence. I mean, it's literally a click away to find out whether there are any previous convictions that could mean that person shouldn't be around children. Well, child abuse has got to be right up there when you're becoming a foster parent, a guardian, or indeed an adoptive parent. I mean, at the end of the day, you've shown that you can't be trusted. But no, apparently not. In fact, let's go through his full criminal record. So on the 20th of the 12th, 1988, conspiracy to commit battery. So clearly violent. 18th of the 10th, 1989, just a year later, theft and criminal damage to property, so can't be trusted. 24th of the 10th, 1989, just a bit of felony armed robbery, guys. I mean, this guy sounds like the perfect person to be around children. If I'm not looking for those adoptive guardians or parents or foster parents who haven't got backgrounds in armed robbery and battery, what am I doing with my time? Genuinely, it would be actually comedy, wouldn't it, if we weren't talking about child's murder? Then 24th of the 10th, 1989, busy month for him that month, felony worthless check. So basically that's writing or passing on a bad check. 27th of the 11th, 1989, resisting arrest. 5th of the 1st, 2000, recklessly endangering safety with a dangerous weapon. Oh, just a bit armed and dangerous. Then on the 20th of the 8th, 2009, just some disorderly conduct and also a DJA on felony child abuse. Well, I mean, when I look at people's CVs and I think, who do I want to employ as my nanny? Who do I wish to employ in my day nursery? I look for people with that kind of background because you can be assured that they're really going to be an upstanding citizen who thinks first about the care and compassion of those they have actual responsibility for. Said literally no one ever in the history of anybody looking at that record. But apparently, it was fine where the childcare services were concerned. Yes, Ethan, off you can toddle, go into that home with basically a convicted armed robber who's totally untrustworthy, and likes to use his hands quite a lot. But that happened. Also, it's going to get even worse because in spite of the ironic list, and you will understand why I'm using the word ironic list that I've just read out, apparently Timothy had decided to become a bit God orientated. Not in his actions, but apparently in what he suggested were reasons behind his actions. Yeah, suddenly his household was very strict, very religious. So even though we've seen, shall we say, a lack of Jesus and big God in his heart, apparently now he's just living his life with this very strict religious belief system. And I do get it, guys. There'll be people out there saying, well, you know what? People are alcoholics and drug dependents one week, they go to church and they're cured the next week. Yes, that happens, without a doubt. But you can equally get somebody who just uses the word of the Bible to just beat people with, because you can take specific aspects of it and then you can batter the people in your life, believing that you have a right to because you have verses that seem to mirror what you are suggesting is appropriate behaviour in your household. And I think he falls more into that category than the big love, peace category of the big Jesus Christ. Now, he expected all the children in his house to go ahead and memorize numerous Bible verses and also to obey without question. So I don't know about you, but I'm thinking it's more the Old Testament than he's going for in this situation. Now, I love theology. I studied theology for my undergrads, my GCSEs, my A-levels. Part of my degree, I studied it in line with my psychology because I love theology. I love learning about religions. I love seeing the differences, disparities, commonalities, and I just like listening to those kind of stories. It always has appealed to me. But I also know that when it comes down to quoting Bible verses, in spite of my studies, I can probably give you the 10 Commandments because there's quite a lot of challenging words in the Bible, aren't there? It's quite hard to just memorize it. But if you are given tasks like that to young children, bet your bottom dollar, they might try, but they're going to fail. But if you want them to fail because it then gives you leverage and a permission base to do horrible things to them, well, it's going to work perfectly in your favour. And also that idea about obeying without question. I mean, that's very old school, isn't it? Because the truth is, no, why should I obey you? Why should I not question you? Why do you telling me to do this usurp my level of understanding about whether I should or otherwise? Because actually, if you're just obeying without question, you're an incredibly dangerous human being in the long run, because you can always find somebody who's authoritarian to make you to do things that are really bad. And if you're just like blindly going ahead with it, and I think that part of this story, it plays into that because of one of the perpetrators who seems to kind of take on that mindset. It has ramifications that are deeply problematic. So this is what they have to do. And if they fail to meet those expectations, Timothy obviously then uses it as an excuse to use this unbelievably harsh discipline. Now, neighbours who actually knew the family said they were really shocked at the contrast between what would be considered Timothy's outward role as a caregiver and the actual cruelty that unfolded under his roof. So to them, from the outside looking in, they think that he's a decent human being. But how often do we see this? Because the thing about people is they can show shades of themselves in certain circumstances, and they can withhold the true monster behind closed doors. And that's what's happening here. Now, it's clear, just from the little bit of information I've given you so far, is this is a dysfunctional family. And everybody within it plays a role within that dysfunction. The children are innocent victims, but of course the adults and those who are older in the family, they have to take core responsibility for the fact that it is not running like a family household, it's running like a prison. It genuinely is. Now, Tina McKeever Hauschultz, that's Ethan's great aunt and co-guardian, she's only aged 35 in 2018, so she's a relatively young woman, and she's meant to be sharing responsibility for caring for Ethan and his siblings after they're placed in her home. Now, one of the things that I want to highlight is that she didn't have a criminal record prior to Ethan's death, but she was 100% aware of and involved in the household's disciplinary practices. So as far as I'm concerned, that makes you a full co-conspirator. I really don't want to judge people too harshly unless that harshness is required. We're talking about a woman who may not have had a prison sentence in the past or any criminal convictions in the past, but we are talking about a woman who stood willingly and allowed a child to die knowingly as he was treated horrifically in her presence. So with respect, she's guilty as hell. Now, Timothy, he was seen as the head of the household. Again, how convenient, when you suddenly get into the old religion. Well, I'm the man of the house. I must be in charge. Wasn't I created first by our Lord? Yes, you were. You were created first. But then, God was like, hey, I can do better. No, I'm joking. I love men, I love women, but we were created equal. It's as simple as that. But a lot of religions, they like to put the man at the top, don't they? They like to put him up there. And how convenient that in this household, that's what's happening. So he's the one who dictated punishments for the children, and Tina just follows his lead. So again, I'm giving her absolutely no credit there, because with respect, you don't have to. It's very easy to go, you know what? I'm not going to follow your lead. I'm just going to go to the police and talk about what an abusive POS you are. That's what you should do. Now, Tina also had children of her own with Timothy. They had a daughter, and she was also presumably involved in raising Damian, one of the other kids who lived there. Now, their daughter, she's often referred to in the court case as child 3, and in legal documents she's referred to as child 3. She was born on December the 24th, 2006. And again, she's somebody who just goes along with Timothy's really strict abusive parenting methods. Now, given Timothy's criminal past, CPS and social services had actually had some involvement with the family, which I find both bizarre and ludicrous in equal measure because they placed Ethan there. In fact, it turns out that social workers had gone ahead and met with the Hauschultz family during the placement process, so before Ethan was placed there, and they were actually aware of some of the unconventional discipline practices that were in place. Like, genuinely, they knew about it. And when I tell you shortly about those practices, it's going to blow your minds. And one state senator actually noted that workers felt pressured to make placements that they didn't feel were necessarily safe in Ethan's case. Sorry? What? Yes, we felt pressured to place him in an unsafe place. Isn't that literally the opposite of what you're meant to do? Yes, it is, but we felt pressured. Shouldn't you just have said no? Well, I mean, now you put it like that, it seems quite a reasonable suggestion. But no, we just thought we could say no, but we're quite pressured. So we're just going to put this kid in a really unsafe environment and just, fingers crossed, see how it goes. I mean, to talk about an abandonment of care, to talk about a failure of a system, it doesn't even do enough to describe what I've just said, does it? There aren't words that are enough to describe the lack of care and compassion on the workers' parts where Ethan is concerned. Now let's talk about Damian Hauschultz. So this is one of the children who lived under that roof. He was born on the 19th of November in 2003. So he's the 14-year-old son of Timothy. Therefore, he'd be considered Ethan's cousin. Now, by 2018, Damian had actually been adopted by the Hauschultz's family for many years, and details of his adoption I've looked up, but they're not public, but he was born with the same name, so he could have been a relative they adopted, or he could be a relative they fostered previously, but basically he's been in their lives for a long time. Now, bear in mind, when Ethan is there as a very small child, Damian is a teenager, he's considerably larger, he's stronger than 7-year-old Ethan, and Timothy has schooled Damian well. If Timothy isn't present, Damian is going to be the one who enforces the rigorous rules. And Damian has fallen into this role and has grasped it by both hands. And I feel from doing this research that Damian actually enjoys the power he gets from harming the other children. And I suppose you can look at that in two different ways. Psychologically, if you're an abused child yourself and you have the opportunity to work for your authority figure that you're afraid of, and that authority figure then goes easier on you in your punishments because you are acting in an appropriate way as far as that person is concerned by damaging the other children, that means that you're getting two things: a level of validation and self-worth through the eyes of the authority figure that you wish to impress, and also a release of the frustration and anger that you feel is pent up because of the abuse you suffered. So you project that onto those who are weaker than you. And then again, that creates a cycle of causation where you are then once again validated by the primary caregiver, who's meant to be the person who's authoritative over those younger children that they place you in authority over. So you can understand how that very much plays into the psyche of Damian. That's just my opinion, but I think it's a very multi-layered reasoning behind his actions, including a level of malevolence within him. Now, Damian was basically under Timothy's thumb, I'd say. So he had been so brought up in an environment of normalised violence that he just had no issue in going ahead and carrying out really horrendously disciplinarian actions towards these younger children who were just helpless against him. I think he genuinely wanted to impress, like I said, the authority figures, also wanted an outlet for all of that stress he felt, and also kind of enjoyed the power. Now, before April 2018, it's worth noting that Damian doesn't have any juvenile criminal record, but Ethan's siblings, they ended up speaking to the authorities and said that Damian frequently carried out Timothy's punishments on them. And this is where that conflict I was talking about at the beginning of this case comes up, because I guess there's some complex questions, aren't there, about Damian's culpability. So do we just see him as a willing bully, or do we also explore the possibility of him being an indoctrinated child who's just following his parents' cruel orders, maybe even to save himself? And that's a quandary, isn't it, when you actually consider what kind of a household he's growing up in. Now, in the months that Ethan lived with the Hauschultzes, so that's late 2017 to early 2018, just bear in mind what a short time period that is and what we're talking about. I mean, it's ludicrous to me that this child was placed in that home and then died so quickly at the hands of these individuals. Apparently, during that period of time, the household was utterly drenched in these severe forms of discipline and abuse. Timothy had a particular penchant for getting the kids to carry heavy wooden logs. So particularly the young children, he would give them really heavy logs to carry in all weathers, particularly freezing cold weather. And this was used routinely. So this was normal. And the kids actually called it carrying wood. So this is what they see as part and parcel of their experience living there, that if they did anything that was perceived as wrong, they would have to carry wood. Now, in the week of Ethan's death, all 3 children were forced to carry logs for 2 hours each day as a punishment for not reciting Bible verses correctly. Now, this is really distressing on a range of levels. First of all, by the way, the logs were just unholy in size comparison to the children. So these are incredibly heavy. Just imagine having to hold a log in your arms and walk with it for long periods of time when the log itself is just unbelievably heavy to carry and is exhausting for you, and you get into trouble if you drop it. So you have this constant fear that's going on in your mind. Add to that the reason that you're carrying the log is because you failed to be able to perfectly recite the Bible. Well, let me tell you, one of the worst things for memory is stress. We've all been there. We've all experienced it. We've all had to try to learn for our exams, etc. Some people are blessed and they have memories and anxiety levels that are both positive for the memory and low in the anxiety. So they just do it more easily. But if you're a normal, typical kid, if you're not somebody blessed with that capacity, stress is going to interfere with your learning. If all you're doing when you're sitting reading that verse and trying to memorize it is thinking to yourself, oh my God, I'm not going to get it right, I'm not going to get it right. And then when it comes to being tested, you don't, because you are so stressed and anxious, you are going to end up carrying those logs. So it's a vicious cycle because you can't memorize because you're so traumatized. Now, Timothy seemed to take great pleasure in this kind of harsh discipline and abuse. He would actually go out of his way to select a really large piece of wood, and then the children literally have to lug it around a path outside the house. They were only allowed 5-second rests between laps. And after this, they have to pick up the log again and walk another lap. Now, Timothy is the person specifically picking out the log that each child's going to carry. So he's the one picking out the size of the log, the weight of the log, which log each child will carry, and also deciding on the duration each child will walk. Now, beyond this forced labour, there were also reports of physical abuse tied to the punishment. So they would strike the children with belts or sticks if they dared to slow down. Damian, the older child, he'd hit them and kick them during the sessions. Now, Tina said that she was aware that Timothy used those forms of discipline. So again, she's letting this pass. And Timothy and Tina were both aware that Damian had absolutely taken on this violence and was being physically abusive to Ethan, and at least one of his siblings had had violence towards them in the past as well. But no one's doing anything about this. And Timothy would actually arrogantly describe to the police why he actually made them carry wood, because his excuse was, well, in the past I've hit a child and I got into trouble for that in the past. Not maybe abusing children is wrong. Therefore, I realised the error of my ways, corrected the way I act, and don't do anything violent towards because no, just like, well, I just thought to myself, maybe abusing them by making them carry heavy logs that are far too heavy for them in treacherous conditions was probably something that these child services would be totally okay with. You know, it's ludicrous. Now, in the week prior to Ethan's death, apparently, Ethan really struggled to recite Bible verses to Timothy's satisfaction, but we can all imagine Timothy will have a very high level of perfectionism in what meets the bar because he likes harming kids. Let's just be real about this. Listen, this isn't about Bible verses. This isn't about failing to memorize them in a way that's appropriate. This is about a man, a grown-ass man, who wants to hurt kids, who gets some satisfaction of knowing that they're all in pain. He's a sadist. That's what sadists do. Would not be surprised whatsoever if he found it quite sexually provoking for him, actually knowing that all those children were having to do things that they didn't want to do and that he was there all powerful, because that's what sadists are like. And he also said that because Ethan was struggling to recite those Bible verses, he decided to extend the log carrying punishment daily for a week, 1 whole week, that this little boy is meant to endure. And bear in mind, the weather in Wisconsin that April was really cold. There was patches of snow and ice that just covered the grounds around the property. Ethan was already absolutely exhausted. He was possibly bruised from days of punishment. And then every single day of abuse is just going to drain his energy further, drain his strength further, drain his life force further. And the sad thing is that no one outside of the household even knows the full extent of what's happening. In fact, there were no immediate reports to authorities before that fateful day of the 20th of April 2018. Now, on the 20th of April 2018, law enforcement do go to the Hauschultz property. It's located at 3711 Clover Road. Timothy is with them. Now, Detective Herman looks around the yard. Apparently, about 60% of it is covered with snow, and there's lower lying areas that have got water in them. And this is where Timothy explains to the officer that the children would walk around the woodpile. Said they walked 15 feet. Dropped the log, rested. Well, he didn't rest, did they? You gave him 5 seconds. That's not a rest. But this is his explanation. Then they'd walk around another 15 feet, drop the wood, rest, pick it up, etc. He said, if the children want to talk back, they can go and carry wood. Just the minimization there, they can go and carry wood. That just doesn't express what I'm expressing right now. It's not carrying wood, it's being tortured by carrying heavy logs in freezing conditions without rest. It's absolutely heinous torture. They also commented that the backyard was wet, and that Ethan may have slipped and hit his head on something. He also goes on to say that Ethan was clumsy. Ethan's not clumsy. He's cognitively at an age where actually his body is developing much faster to some degree than his brain is being able to conceive of, which is why kids don't realise their size and bang into things. It's very, very common. So actually being clumsy is completely in line with his age frame. Now, the police enter the yard. They go to the block of wood near the snow pile because this is where Ethan had been located. And the block of wood, which was later literally identified as the log carried by Ethan, it was observed to be a section of a tree trunk which had had the bark removed. And it wasn't a split piece of wood. It was a full section of tree trunk. I mean, how heavy would that have been? And next to that block, there was blood found in the snow. And they said that the snow was actually piled in such a way that it suggested an outlay of a person the exact same size as Ethan. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you he was there for a period of time. Now, logs that had been carried by Ethan and child one, they get collected, they get used as evidence, obviously, so they weigh them. Ethan's log weighed 44.4 pounds. I mean, that's so heavy. Child one's log weighed 35.6 pounds, again, horrendously heavy. And their children themselves, they only weighed approximately 60 to 62 pounds. Just let that sink in. He was carrying something 2/3 of his own weight, constantly, for hours in the freezing cold. And that's carrying wood. Absolute BS. Imagine what that little boy and his twin were going through when they were walking around. Imagine the agony that they would have felt in their arms, in their body. Imagine the sheer determination they would have had to just carry on. And that's before we compound all the abuse that's gone on before, leading to him being covered in obvious bruises and blunt force trauma. Now, on the 20th of April 2018 at 4:04 p.m, Deputy Hayes actually made contact with Timothy and Tina. Timothy told Deputy Hayes that as a consequence for doing wrong, the children had been carrying out wood that day while he and Tina were not at home. So he basically says, listen, I don't know exactly what happened because I wasn't present at the address when Ethan became so gravely unwell. But he said from what Damian, the 14-year-old said, is that he'd looked back at Ethan and he'd started to laugh because he thought that Ethan was faking that he was unwell because he was lying over a log, and he basically thought that he was just trying to get out of his punishment. So at this point, Damian, as opposed to being concerned, walks over to Ethan, tells him to get up, and said that basically Ethan likes to screw around a lot. So again, we're blaming Ethan at this point because he's immobile and obviously in some kind of critical pain. So instead of helping him at this point, the kids together throw snow at him. And they said at that point it's because they didn't know that anything was actually wrong with Ethan. But then once they realise something's wrong, they do go ahead and call Timothy. He was away from the home for about an hour and 15. He said when he got back, he was really kind of pissed off because he said, what on earth has happened whilst I've been out? He's not immediately concerned. He's just pissed off that these things have kicked off while he's not been present. And Damian said, I don't know, maybe he fell on the ice, maybe he fell on the log, maybe his head or something. So no one's taken any responsibility for it. Now, they do confirm that Damian had called him twice, and once said that Ethan was lying over a piece of wood and not moving, and that Damian didn't know if he was playing possum. And Timothy said to Damian that they'd come home at this point. So when they get back and they obviously observe Ethan in the yard lying over a log face down, which is just blindsiding because what on earth has gone on there? Why hasn't the direction been get Ethan inside, make sure he's warm, make sure he's safe, check that you don't need to call emergency services? I mean, it just goes without saying that would be a normal reaction. But no, they've taken ages to get back and Ethan's just been left in the yard. Now, Damian said he didn't know if Ethan had fallen and hit his head, and Timothy at this point decided to take him inside to warm him up. He said they were home for around 10 minutes and then they decided to take him to the hospital. But bear in mind all that time that has passed and this child has been immobile in the snow in the freezing weather, injured and clearly in a mess. And yet nothing has been done till this point. Now, Deputy Hayes asked Timothy if he observed any injuries to Ethan's body when he was drying him off. He said, is there any injuries that were consistent with fighting, or are the children maybe not telling the truth? Have you seen any blood? And Timothy then said, no, then started apparently speaking quicker, just said that he wasn't home and they just got home, kind of deflecting, like, I don't know anything. And, my instance of seeing that Ethan wasn't well was when I walked in. So just deflecting. Now, obviously, the police are really concerned that there is more to this story, and obviously there are other witnesses available because there were other children who were involved. So they bring in child one. They're interviewed on the 20th of April 2018, and Detective Chris Bessler, that's who interviewed this particular child. They were born on the 13th of September 2010, and so they're very, very young. The first thing that Detective Bessler notices is this child has got a scratch near their eye, a bruise on his forehead, bruising to his legs and abdomen. So again, very evident of abuse. And he says, well, this is a result of Damian, the older child. He said, Damian threw me to the ground, kicked me in the behind, slapped me with wood. Now, Detective Herman, at this point, enters the room because they want to photograph the injuries. They want to catalogue them. And at this point, he also notices another mark on his ear. Now, marks on ears are red flags abuse-wise because it's not a normal, typical injury. It tends to mean somebody has grabbed you or pinched you. It's not something you would ordinarily see in an innocent injury. Now, Child One said that the reason that he had that mark on his ear was because Timothy would grab his ears and pull on them if they didn't carry wood. He said they were actually old injuries. They didn't occur the same day that he was being interviewed, and they didn't occur on the day that Ethan died. He also said that he felt he had to carry wood a lot. He'd been carrying it that day. He'd been carrying, in fact, wood all that week before Ethan's death. That had started on Saturday the 14th of April 2018. And actually, he was told he had to carry wood every day of the week for 2 hours. Also, he said Damian was outside carrying wood during that time as well. Now, Child One was not allowed to stop for any reason. So he wasn't allowed to go inside. He wasn't allowed to take a break. Until that punishment was complete, he had to carry wood. He said that if he dared to stop, or if he by mistake dropped the wood, or because it became so heavy, Damian would literally kick him, whack him with wood, punch him in the nose, give him face washes, and throw him in mud puddles. He said after Damian had done that, he'd then have to get up. He'd have to continue carrying wood in the cold while wearing wet clothes. And he said on the 20th of April, Damian had whacked him with a piece of wood in the ankle, which was then bruised, and that caused him to actually limp, but he had to carry on. He also stated that on the 19th of April, that's the day before his interview, that he did drop the wood, and so he got more punishments. So, for example, he had to eat porridge while stood at the table while the rest of the family sat down and had nice food. That's just such a torturous thing to do to a child. It's really humiliating and dehumanising. But this is what's going on in that household. So it's not just the exterior punishments, it's the interior punishments. He said that after he dropped his wood, Damian continuously threw him to puddles, gave him a bloody nose by shoving chunks of ice into his face. He wasn't allowed to go into the house to tend to his bloody nose. He's just got to carry on. And he said that they weren't in school that day, and instead, because they hadn't gone to school, again, they had to carry wood as punishment for 2 hours, and that Damian was just kind of being authoritarian and watching them. And he said Damian does also have to carry wood if he doesn't know his Bible verses, but it's always clear that Damian's log isn't as heavy as Ethan or Child One's log. And of course, Damian is way bigger than them. And he said that he could see that Damian on that particular day was kicking Ethan a lot more than normal, and Ethan dropped his wood more than once, and at one point Ethan fell backwards with the log on his chest, and Damian actually saw Ethan trying to get the log off his chest. Bear in mind, he was only 62 pounds and the log's 44 pounds. That's going to be really hard on him. It's going to be hard to move it off his chest. So he's trying to get that log off his chest, but instead Damian goes over and rolls the log up and down Ethan's body, which is going to be incredibly painful. Now, apparently that was really upsetting for Ethan. He cried, but then he just knows he's got to get up. He's got to resume carrying the log. Child One then recalls Damian telling Ethan to lie down. He then shoves him into the ground into a puddle. It's freezing outside, bear this in mind. Whilst Ethan is lying on the ground with his face in the puddle, Damian's standing on his back. Bear in mind, one of the autopsy features was by the cracked rib number 11, they saw an imprint of a boot. And that was very much in context with what we're talking about here, isn't it? That Damian's putting the full force of his weight on Ethan's back. Now, Ethan at this point is crying understandably. He just says, let me get up, I'll carry wood again. Damian just says, shut up. And then Damian starts covering him with snow. Now, Ethan at this point is trying to get out of the snow, trying to move his arms, but Damian prevents him doing it. Now, at this point, child one completed his punishment, and obviously they're probably just thinking about their own needs to go in and get a shower. Now, as child one leaves, he notices that Ethan's on the ground and is now partially covered with snow. Damian then gets a shovel and then covers Ethan entirely in the snow. He was left for 30 minutes in that freezing temperature. He's got snow piled on him. He's badly injured. He's absolutely exhausted. And he's just been left in freezing temperatures. A child of 7. Now, child 1 said that Timothy is occasionally home when he's carrying wood and that he knows Damian hurts them. So he says, Timothy allows Damian to hurt us. He encourages it. There's no punishment for Damian. In fact, if Damian's really nasty to us, often Timothy goes more lightly on him. And he described Damian as a bully and said that Ethan told Timothy that Damian hurts them. And Timothy just basically responded, well, maybe you shouldn't drop wood. So he's totally on side with Damian. He's created this little monster and he enjoys watching him carry out the work that he's been taught, which is the torture of these children. Child 1 also said that he really didn't feel safe at home because Damian hurts him and Ethan. This is just a hellhole these kids are in. Now, child 2 was interviewed. They were interviewed the next day, which was the 21st of April 2018. The date of birth of this child was the 18th of November 2009. Now, child 2 didn't actually have to carry wood on the 20th of April, but they were playing outside. They were able to confirm that Damian hit Ethan and child 1 with sticks on their behinds and backs because they kept dropping wood. And this child said, I think they were dropping wood because it was just too heavy. They believed that child 1 and Ethan were really scared of Damian. They were scared of what he would do to them. And she said she wasn't sure why Damian was so angry that day. She also said that she saw Ethan was buried in the snow and that Damian took Ethan's boots off to make him even colder and then buried him in the snow using a shovel, then packed the snow down. Ethan then obviously begs Damian, can I get up? He said, I'll carry on carrying wood like you want me to, but Damian wouldn't let him. Then Damian steps on Ethan's head before covering him in snow. Now, when he's covered in snow, child 2 said, I couldn't see any of Ethan's body. I couldn't see his face. And she said that she couldn't actually estimate how long Ethan was encased in snow for, but that Damian was the one ultimately in the end who took him out. And she said at this point, Ethan looked like he looked when he went to the hospital, but at this point he was making noises. So he was obviously so fatally injured at this point that, yes, he's mumbling, but it was too far gone even at this point likely for him to survive. Now, child 2 said that Timothy and Tina were absolutely aware of just how hard Damian was on her and her siblings. So there was no doubt that they were unaware of the abuse that was happening through Damian's hands. She also said that when she went and told Timothy that Damian was being really aggressive with them, basically he didn't do anything to stop Damian. Just occasionally he'd say, keep your hands off child 1 and Ethan. But it wasn't consistent. It was only because on occasion it was complained about. Now, there's a follow-up interview on the 7th of May 2018. This is when child 2 is interviewed at the Willow Tree Cornerstone Child Advocacy Centre. And that child repeated much of the same information as in the first interview, but they did add that Ethan's belt was continuously being adjusted when he carried the log on the 20th of April. Now, ultimately, they said that Damian forced Ethan to take his belt off, then took it from him and used it to beat him. Damian also hit the two boys so much that a metal piece off the belt broke off. Damian then went ahead and found a stick with prickles on it to hit them with instead. I mean, this guy is horrible. I know that we are talking about a boy who has been brought up in this really inappropriate environment. I know that he's been groomed to act in this way and he's been validated by an authority figure. But the truth is, it wouldn't matter who was bringing me up, what they were forcing me to do. I would never, ever do this of my own volition. Literally, I wouldn't do it if somebody was telling me, stood over my shoulder, do it or you die. I just don't have it in me. Damian has malevolence in him without a shadow of a doubt. He's enjoying it. He's sadistic, just like Timothy is. They also described Damian standing on Ethan in the mud puddle with one foot on his back and one foot on his head. This is in water. I mean, this is horrific. And Damian's shouting at him not to move. She said that she became really concerned for Ethan because he was just obviously encased in the snow. She said, look, he can't breathe. And can I take some of the snow out? And at this point, she and child 3, they also thought Damian had gone far too far. So at this point, he does remove a small amount of snow where he thought Ethan's mouth was, but it was far too little, far too late. Now, it was noted by all of the kids that when they took Ethan out of the snow, he was totally unresponsive. So Damian at this point tells child 3 to get a bucket of hot water and says, if he's faking it, this will hurt. So absolutely no conscience about what his actions have created. Absolutely no compassion for this very sick child. Just glee at the idea that maybe he's making this up and we can hurt him more with this hot water. Now, when it came down to child 3 was interviewed and they were born on the 24th of December 2006. They said Damian gets really mad if child 1 or Ethan doesn't listen. They'd seen Damian shove Ethan's face into a mud puddle on the 20th of April because he wasn't listening. Knew that Damian called Timothy about Ethan not carrying wood. Knew that once Ethan was buried, that she could hear him make these strange noises she was worried about. Went on and told child 2 when this was playing out that she thought Damian was being too rough. Noted that Damian did unbury Ethan using his hands and the shovel, but that Damian thought that Ethan was faking it. And as I said, advised them to go and get hot water, which he then threw on Ethan, which again is incredibly dangerous when the child is already suffering from hypothermia. Now, when Timothy comes back and finds Ethan unresponsive, he actually asked child 3 if Damian did something he usually doesn't do. And that child described his usual behaviours as face washes, pushing and kicking, but did confirm that Damian had used a long stick to hit the backs of the boys' bodies. But isn't it interesting that Timothy is asking that question, projecting the possibility of blame whilst not acknowledging his own accountability for creating this monster? Because that's exactly what's happened. He's created this monster. Now, in a follow-up interview with child 3, 7th of May 2018, where they're interviewed at the Willow Tree Cornerstone Child Advocacy Centre, they described Damian as being really mad on that afternoon of the 20th of April, and that they were confident that Timothy was absolutely aware of the physical punishments and injuries Ethan and child 1 were subjected to regularly. So they're saying, listen, Timothy is fully aware and fully on board with what Damian does to these kids. Now, they also said that when Ethan or child 1 didn't listen to Tina, she would actually have them go outside without shoes on to stand on the gravel. And bear in mind, it was really cold outside. And apparently child 1's hands had become very cold. He was allowed back inside to put his hands under hot water. But obviously that's kind of a punishment as well, because it's really painful when it's so cold to do that. And he said that that kind of punishment was used 2 or more times between autumn and spring. Also, child 1 had been seen outside kneeling on gravel and holding ice cubes in his hands. And this was when, again, the weather was really cold. So this is Tina who's enforcing that punishment. This is why I'm calling her a co-conspirator. Now, of course, with all of this information, the police need to speak to Damian, because Damian is certainly an antagonist in this scenario. Irrespective of how he's been coerced and groomed, he is of his own volition carrying out the most heinous attacks on these children. In fact, most likely causing the death of Ethan. So Lieutenant Remiker ends up speaking with Damian at the hospital that they'd taken Ethan to. So they spoke with Damian about the bruises and also, of course, the marks on Ethan. And Damian basically said, I know he messed around. I give him face washes occasionally. But then said, I didn't do anything that would have hurt him. So he's a consummate liar as well as an abuser. Damian basically tried to play it down. So I was just poking him, I was prodding him, just wanted to get him moving. And then went on to say that, he was constantly falling with the log and Ethan kept doing that. And then once when he fell with the log, it rolled onto Ethan. So he's trying to kind of minimize and mitigate, isn't he? He also said that Ethan carried the log some stupid, weird way and that sometimes he stumbled backwards. Yes, Damian, because the log weighed almost the same amount as the child. Also, he went on to say that he just found Ethan lying over a log and that he had absolutely nothing to do with seeing him fall and being involved with what happened to him after that. Now, Lieutenant Remiker said what might have caused Ethan's condition, and of course Damian says, I don't know. He just passed out from exhaustion. That's the kind of thing he's trying to portray. He's completely innocent. It's had nothing to do with these horrific injuries. He didn't bury him in the snow, even though all the witnesses say he did, and now it's just an absolute quandary, just an absolutely bizarre thing that seems to have played out without me being involved at all or even knowing what happened, because even when I was present and I was the one literally digging him into the snowy grave, none of this I remember because I just was an innocent bystander. I mean, it's just so frustrating. And it also shows a level of manipulation in where Damian is concerned. Whatever we are talking about, I know he's a 14-year-old boy, but there is something deeply deviant about this human being. He did admit that he'd thrown some snow on Ethan with the other kids, so he's blaming them as well, apart from child one, who he said didn't. And he actually advised the kids not to pack the snow because it was hard and icy. So now he's trying to say that he was the hero in the story. And he was saying when they were throwing all the snow on Ethan that you shouldn't pat it down or pack it in because it's going to be dangerous. So instead, he's the hero. And actually then he just says, I think maybe we made him a bit cold. You figure? You reckon? Yeah, it would make sense with you burying him alive. He also then said he covered Ethan in snow around his head, but not his face, because he said, I know that we had to make sure he was breathing. He said, I'm not that stupid. Well, that's open to debate, isn't it? He also said he took out a shovel out of the garage because he wanted to shovel snow off the lawn. So that's his excuse for having the shovel there, as opposed to getting it to literally bury Ethan in the snow. Now, Lieutenant Remiker ended up asking how much snow was covering Ethan. And he said, quote, he was in his own little coffin of snow. He actually laughed when he made that comment. I know that I can't diagnose him with conduct disorder, a stroke. He's going to be a massive psychopath when he's older. But, the warning signs are certainly there, aren't they? Without a shadow of a doubt. Laughing by describing Ethan being in a coffin of snow. And that slip of language is really psychologically interesting, because he's basically saying he was buried alive. And indeed, that was a coffin of snow, because Ethan didn't make it out alive. Now, Detective Bessler, they continue interviewing Damian at Manitowoc County Sheriff's Department. Damian, at this point during the interview, says that Timothy had the children carry wood for a set period of time in the backyard as punishment. And he went on to tell the police, if you don't do the punishment well enough, the log will get heavier and you'll have to carry it for longer. He said that Timothy was the main punisher. He said that if Tina's consulted, she'll oftentimes tell the children that they need to go and see what Timothy says. So she'll just project that he's the one who needs to have the power and she can't do anything about it. But again, that's just a lame responsibility whilst also being a co-conspirator. It's as simple as that. At the end of the day, if somebody says, oh, this person's done something wrong, what do I need to do with them? You could equally say, oh, just have some time out, or, don't allow them to play with their toys this afternoon. But to actually say, oh, what you need to do is speak to the real aggressive abuser over here and they'll make a decision, that means that you by proxy are creating the abuse in this cycle. Now, Damian said that the reason Timothy had got so severe with Ethan and child one was because apparently, quote, weren't getting it, and that they still haven't broke and they don't do whatever they want. So the suggestion is, unless you absolutely are core obedient to the parents in this case, the caregivers in this case, then you are going to be punished. And Damian said it was his responsibility to monitor the children carrying the wood when Timothy wasn't there. He said, if you're expected to carry wood, you stay outside regardless of any excuses. It doesn't matter if you're wet, if you're tired, you're expected to complete your punishment. So he's saying that this is just a consistent cycle of abuse with no escape. He also admitted that Timothy was very hard on Ethan and child 1 as well and child 2 as well. He said he didn't want to say no to Timothy because if you argued with him, it wasn't worth your while. He also said that on the 20th of April, he, Ethan, child 1, went outside and had to carry wood for 2 hours. He explained that he had to carry wood during the recent snowstorm, which was Snowstorm Evelyn. And the reason for that was he didn't know 13 Bible verses to Timothy's satisfaction. He confirmed that Timothy selected the logs for each child to carry that day. And he also acknowledged that Ethan and child 1 were carrying logs much heavier than his. Bear in mind, this guy at 14 is way heavier and way stronger than child 1 and Ethan. He also said that Timothy gave Ethan the heaviest log because he acts all powerful and hates to work. So we're just blaming this little boy now. He just acts all powerful and hates to work. Well, no, he doesn't. He's doing exactly what he's told and he's terrified and now he's dead. He also said that his log was about 10 to 12 pounds, so it was more like a stick than a log, and he completed approximately 50 laps. And it needs to be noted that Damian at this point was 5'11", so he's tall. He was 168 pounds. Ethan and child 1 were 4'8" and 60 pounds. So this kid is over 100 pounds heavier and way taller than these two children. Now, he went on to confirm that they began the punishment at 1 p.m. that day, and Damian had to basically drag the boys outside. He said that the ground was mushy and slushy and muddy and wet. Said that at one point, Ethan dropped his log multiple times and fell over, potentially being smooshed, he said, by the log as it laid on his chest and stomach. He said he saw blood on Ethan's nose and thought maybe he'd smashed his face on the log. Said they'd been outside for about 1 to 1.5 hours when he saw Ethan lying over his log with his legs straight out. Now, Ethan at this point didn't respond. So apparently Damian moved into a mud puddle and then covered him in snow and said, you know, if he wanted to play dead, then he should be in a snow coffin. So just an absolute lack of compassion there on every level. Now, the children all end up throwing snow on top of Ethan. Ultimately, he's covered with his face sticking out, as far as Damian is suggesting at this point, because he's saying he made sure that he could breathe. We know that wasn't the case, but this is what he's saying to the police. And apparently at this point, they just left Ethan there for 20 to 30 minutes. So he estimates that about 80 pounds of wet, heavy snow was covering Ethan. Also mentioned that water on the top of the snow might icify or solidify. So causing suffocation, basically. And he said, yeah, you know, I guess it was pretty cold for Ethan, but he allowed him to stay there anyway. Now, whilst Ethan was buried in the snow, obviously he couldn't speak, but he said that Ethan was making noises and slight moans or whines. And then he described Ethan's eyes as being hazy. But none of this is alerting him to get him out of that icy coffin. He also said that while Ethan was being buried in the snow, he was twitching. So apparently his arm would pop up and Damian would just put his arm down so he could bury him again. Then after a certain amount of time, Ethan stopped moving. When Damian finally took him out of the snow, he placed him face down on a log, said he was stiff, statue-like and unresponsive because he was frozen solid. At this point, they ring Timothy, tells him Ethan's playing or acting like he's dead. Timothy was angry with Damian when he got home and said, what did you do? Did you leave him out here? And Damian said at this point it did make him think about maybe he'd seriously hurt Ethan. But he also said that maybe he was just like that before being buried in the snow. So he's trying to again deflect blame. Now, Detective Bessler ended up speaking with Damian again on the 21st of April. Damian actually said to this officer, this is becoming too much of a big thing. So he's like, really confused that anybody's caring about Ethan, and he doesn't understand why it's seemingly getting blown out of proportion in his direction. He said he was confused because he wanted to talk, but he also said that Timothy doesn't want him to talk. And allegedly he became emotional when he was talking about how things had changed with Ethan, child 1 and child 2, and that the changes had been really notable when they came to live at the house. So it annoyed him that those children had arrived and that things had changed. He said that the home had become a really boring prison-like setting. He said having them in the house had taken away all the fun out of his life. So he was obviously frustrated and angry and directing that at the children. He also described himself as always being angry and having a burning anger inside, and that he deals with that by hitting inanimate objects or, of course, by abusing the other children, because that's clearly his outlet now. Now, on the 17th of December 2018, he's interviewed again. At this point, he's told about a conversation he had with Timothy whilst they were en route to the hospital with Ethan. Timothy basically said, listen, we are going to need to get an attorney. We need to get this straightened out. And Timothy told Damian, just say that Ethan fell out of a tree. Make sure you don't get anyone else in trouble. Now, when the police requested to interview Damian later that day, Timothy had actually told him to tell the truth. Now, this was confusing because now he doesn't know how to answer the questions. Now, isn't that interesting? When the police are there, Timothy's like, tell them the truth, but he's already tried to prompt him to do the opposite. But in that moment, with him saying, tell the truth, he's thinking, do I tell the truth? Don't I tell the truth? Did him saying, don't tell the truth mean what I'm meant to do? Or is it now when he's suggested in front of them to tell the truth that I should? And actually, to some degree, that's Timothy's downfall because Damian does start to tell the truth. Now, with the autopsy results and the witness statements, authorities understandably feel they've got enough to rule Ethan's death as a homicide. It only takes a couple of days for them to decide on that. And despite what I consider is clear evidence, the case actually took several months to process through investigative and legal channels. So it wasn't until around January 2019 that the prosecutors were ready to formally charge the 3 family members. Now, that delay did allow time for careful review by the DA's office, the forensic analysis, coordination on how to handle Damian in the legal system, because bear in mind, he's a juvenile. So January 2019, Manitowoc County authorities arrested Timothy, who was 48 at the time, Tina, who was 36, and Damian, who's now 15, in connection with Ethan's death. Now, the charges for Timothy, well, the prosecutors filed this really extensive criminal complaint against him, which reflected his role in ordering and overseeing the abuse that Ethan had been horrifically subjected to. He was charged with 8 counts, so felony murder as a party to a crime, intentionally contributing to the delinquency of a child, resulting in death, intent to contribute to the delinquency of a child, which is a felony charge, 2 counts of physical abuse of a child abuse with failure to prevent harm, misdemeanor battery. So in essence, Timothy's been held accountable for every aspect of the crime through party to a crime liability. So he might not have been the one inflicting the final wounds. He might not have been present at the final death. He might not have been the one who had literally seen what played out that day and ignored it. But what he had done leading to that was enough to make him fully liable. Now, if convicted on all counts, Timothy faces the prospect of decades in prison. Amen to that. Do you know what I suggest you should do? Learn the Bible. Just learn it from back to front and from front to back. And I don't know, go through the Torah, try the Quran. I'm sure there's lots of other books that you'll be able to get heavily involved in during your incarceration, because this guy deserves to be in prison for decades. I mean, felony murder alone carries up to 15 extra years on top of the underlying charge. Then we come on to Damian's charges. Now, bear in mind, he was only 14 at the time of the incident, but Damian is charged as an adult because it was so severe, it was so torturous, it was so evil, it was so cruel. Now, prosecutors initially hit Damian with 7 charges. So, first-degree reckless homicide, 3 counts of physical abuse of a child, 3 counts of substantial battery, and this decision to charge Damian as an adult was significant. So Wisconsin law allows waiver into adult court for juveniles in serious cases. And the prosecutor said, listen, when it comes down to serious cases, you just need to look at the brutality of Ethan's death to understand that this absolutely is warranted, that we need to charge him as an adult. Now, if convicted on all the charges, Damian faced near life in prison. Now, when it comes down to Tina, what we can say is that Tina didn't have a hands-on role in the death of Ethan, but she was charged with what she failed to do. So she was charged with 2 felonies. That's child abuse, which is failing to prevent great bodily harm to a child, and failing to prevent mental harm to a child. So essentially, it was alleged that Tina, who's the guardian, absolutely should have had a duty to protect Ethan, and she willfully neglected that duty. Now, each of those felonies are punishable by up to 6 years in prison. Now, on the 18th of February 2019, there was a preliminary hearing set for Timothy and Damian. And on the 20th of February, there was Tina's hearing. Now, during those early hearings, DA Jesselyn Labrie also raised a lot of concerns about Timothy's recorded jail phone calls, because apparently these phone calls hinted at possibly incriminating concerning statements that he'd actually made in custody. They're not the brightest people, are they? I'm just going to go on the phone in prison where it clearly tells me that I may be recorded, and I'm just going to say really incriminating things about myself. Honestly, it blows my mind. This happens time and time again, and yet they never seem to get the memo, do they? And when it came down to the initial bail, high cash bonds were imposed because these charges are so severe, and reports actually suggested that Timothy's bond was 6 figures. Now, over time, Timothy's defence actually sought modifications, so their bail was reduced to $75,000. The conditions were actually adjusted. So by 2023, Timothy was out on bond with very strict supervision. That included no contact with minors and also limited contact with family pending the trial. Damian, however, he remained in juvenile detention. Tina, from the get-go, she was out on bail, so she was with her husband, basically. Now, a significant pre-trial event was the juvenile waiver hearing for Damian. So his defence attorneys said, listen, he's only 15. So they wanted that case moved to juvenile court because the penalties would be lesser, and obviously they'd focus on rehabilitation. We get to July 2019. At this point, Judge Geraldine Dietz heard the arguments on this matter. Ultimately, Judge Dietz ruled that Damian would be tried as an adult and said the extreme brutality of the crime meets that bar. She said the outcome here was tragic, heartbreaking, and completely foreseeable given the abuse Damian caused upon Ethan. This case is extremely brutal. Now, Tina's case gets resolved first. 2021, she gets a plea bargain, so she doesn't have to go to trial. She pled no contest to the 2 felony charges against her. Now, in return for that, prosecutors did not pursue any additional charges. So by taking the no contest plea, Tina did not admit guilt verbally, but accepted that the prosecution had enough evidence to convict her. So in October 2021, she got 5 years in state prison. Personally, I think 5 years is pathetic when you think about the actual ramifications of this case. Ethan died and she got 5 years. So in October 2021, Tina was sentenced to just 5 years in state prison. I mean, don't get me wrong, she got 5 years extended supervision to follow prison, but 5 years being completely involved in child's murder and abuse, 5 years. I mean, it's nothing. Don't get me wrong, at her sentence hearing, Tina was apologising multiple times for failing Ethan. I'm so sorry. Apparently, in an emotional statement, she said, if given another chance at life, I will get extensive counselling for both me and my family. I know changes need to be made, and I will be the first one to admit and actively work to change for the good. I was a follower in the past, and now I am to be a leader. She accepted the sentence without appeal, but of course she did, because she got off lightly. And that means that in January 2024, Tina was released from prison. Yeah, she's on extended supervision. That's going to be in place until around 2026 to 2027. But nonetheless, she is free. It's really shocking. And even more shocking is she's still with Timothy, this torturous, murderous man. They're still together. Oh, I'm not going to be a follower anymore. I'm going to be a leader. Well, if I was you, sweetheart, I'd lead yourself straight down to the divorce courts. But, you know, she hasn't got that memo either. Now, when it came down to Damian's case, and this might be where some of you are conflicted, some of you might genuinely believe that he should be tried as a minor. You may think that he can change. You may think that he's been coerced and groomed. And I'm on the fence here, with respect, I'm on the fence here. He's evil at core to some degree, without a doubt, because the malevolence is running through his veins and he seems to get a great deal of enjoyment and joy out of harming people. But equally, he's been given a lot of praise and validation for that by an authority figure. So it's really hard to see which way this should go. So Damian's case actually moved quite slowly at first. He did plead not guilty to all charges against him. And his defence basically was going to argue that Timothy's influence mitigated his culpability. But when he was facing overwhelming evidence and also the likelihood of a really lengthy sentence, Damian actually agreed to a plea deal. That was in September 2021. He was 17. So Damian went ahead and pled guilty to first-degree reckless homicide. And as part of that deal, all the other charges were dismissed. They were read in the record for the sentencing considerations, but nonetheless, they were dismissed. Now, Judge Dietz ultimately sentenced Damian to 20 years in prison, along with a very lengthy period of extended supervision that was going to follow his release. The exact length hasn't been reported, but it's assumed to be around 10 years. So this means that assuming Damian serves the entire sentence, he will be around 38 by the time he's released. Still plenty of time to find a woman, get married, have a family, etc. Something that little Ethan was treacherously denied. Now, Damian did attempt to appeal his conviction. That was in 2024, but this was rejected, and subsequently Damian petitioned the Wisconsin Supreme Court. In September 2024, however, the state Supreme Court declined to hear his case because he deserves what he gets. It's as simple as that. He could have got a lot longer if he hadn't taken that plea deal. Now, Timothy's case, very complex, because Timothy's pleaded not guilty to all the charges against him. His case has experienced repeated delays. Now, some were strategic with respect. Bear in mind, Damian was a key witness to this case, so Timothy's defence waited for Damian's case to conclude, even pursuing appeals that tied up proceedings, e.g. appealed the adult court decision for Damian, arguing it might impact Timothy's case. Then there was other delays because COVID hit, and that slowed jury trials in 2020. Then another thing that delayed was in 2022, there was a key pre-trial battle that came over expert testimony. So Timothy's defence sought to call social workers to testify that his methods of discipline, like log carrying, had been discussed with them and suggested they were not obviously criminal. Now, that's just horrendous, isn't it? The fact that he'd obviously expressed that to the social workers and they hadn't been mortified, and that in his mind validated that kind of discipline is bonkers, but true. That's what he was going for. Now, Judge Dietz initially barred those testimonies as irrelevant or not timely disclosed because obviously they're saying, this should have all been done initially and not been delayed just to create more of an issue with you not having to go to trial. So the trial is then scheduled for the 24th of February to the 5th of March 2025. In early 2025, there was a tentative plea agreement reached. On the 20th of February 2025, Timothy was brought to a court hearing for a plea hearing where both the prosecution and defence agreed he would plead guilty to just 2 felony abuse charges. So the remaining 6 charges, including murder, would get dismissed. But Judge Dietz rejected this plea deal. I like Judge Dietz. In fact, they said, I am very uncomfortable with this plea deal. In fact, she said this plea deal would not result in a fair outcome and isn't in the public's best interest. So this means that Timothy's original not guilty plea stood. Now, Timothy's defence motioned for Judge Dietz to recuse herself after this, claiming she was biased, but this was denied. Bizarrely, through all of this, Timothy's remained free on bond. He's actually permitted supervised contact with his now adult daughter and with his wife Tina. Now, a new future trial for Timothy has been scheduled for the 1st of October 2025. The court has actually set aside around 7 to 8 days. They anticipate that more than a week of testimony and evidence will occur. The prosecution also plans to call witnesses including Ethan's siblings, Damian, and also forensic experts. The defence has basically indicated it will argue that Timothy did not intend serious harm and that his form of discipline, whilst excessive, was not meant to kill. Now, it remains to be seen whether his scheduled trial will go ahead or if Timothy will again attempt more appeals and delays. Judge Dietz has actually said any plea deal for Timothy must include guilty pleas to the more serious charges. So stacked together, Timothy could face 40 to 50 years in prison. That's if he's found guilty on all counts. Bear in mind, given the fact that he's currently in his mid-50s, a maximum sentence could genuinely mean life behind bars for him. And I really do have a hell of a lot of respect for Judge Dietz because, my God, do we need judges who don't allow these sneaky plea deals to mean that the victim does not get justice. Now, in the wake of Ethan's death, Wisconsin lawmakers moved really quickly to ensure that this situation would never happen again. So in the summer of 2021, a bipartisan bill called Ethan's Law was introduced and also passed unanimously by state legislature. This law makes it illegal for the CPS to place a child with a guardian who has a felony conviction for child abuse and neglect on the record. I mean, that should never have happened anyway, but at least now it's written down in law. State Senator Andre Jacques, who championed the bill, said no child should go through what he experienced. Ethan's death, at least, I suppose, is helping to expose the flaws in the system. July 2021, Governor Tony Evers signed Ethan's law into effect. Ethan's biological mother, another victim in this case, Andrea Everett, she was present for that signing. She said, it's hard to move forward every day knowing my son isn't coming back. There's no easy day. I learned to live with the pain that I'll never ever see my son again. That's the reality. Like, I was struggling. My kids went to a foster home and I didn't get one of my kids back. It's heartbreaking to me that it cost my son his life for a bill to be made like this. The system failed my children because my son lost his life and I've watched my other children mentally lose their lives too. Very powerful words and absolutely right. She was struggling. They took the children away and she didn't get one of her children back. For her, that cross to bear is a lifelong burden without a doubt. This case is one of those that has many moving parts. I hope I've explained it well enough. But I suppose what I want to ask you is your feelings on whether Damian should indeed have received that sentence or whether you see him as a victim too. I believe that he did require a sentence. And I think when you look at the judicial system in the United States, he could have got a life without parole sentence for murder. So he will get to live freely again at the age of 38. I hope during that period of time, he's going to get a lot of work done with him, a lot of counselling, a lot of understanding of his impact. I hope he grows, develops, is educated, and that when he is freed finally, he's a much better human being that comes out of prison than went into prison. Equally, I think a lot of people might think that his sentence was harsh because he was essentially schooled and groomed by Timothy. I have no doubt whatsoever in my mind that Timothy deserves an absolutely harsher sentence than Damian. I really believe that because without his puppet master place and position, none of this would have occurred. Take care, guys. Always, as ever, let me know your thoughts. I read the comments. Do you agree with me? Or do you have a different point of view on this and maybe think that Timothy and Damian need to live the rest of their lives rotting in prison? Like I said, see you again next time. Be safe.